It was September of 1944, in the Western Pacific, on the road back to the Philippines. There was an island there called Peleliu, a low shelf of coral lying flat on the water, ringed by a reef a man could walk on at low tide, with an airfield laid across its southern end. That airfield was the reason anyone had ever looked at it twice. From the air it looked simple. The photograph showed a ridge running up the middle of the island, rounded and green under low scrub, the kind of ground a rifle company crosses in a morning. The word passed down before the landing was that the fighting would be very tough and very short. 4 days. That was the number in the envelope, and it was the number they carried across the reef. The ridge in the photographs was not a ridge. Under the scrub, it was a broken country of coral spines and sinkholes and caves, cut and tunneled and lived in by men who had been ordered to sell the island as slowly and as expensively as they could. The island was declared secure 73 days later. This is the complete story of Peleliu, the 4 days that became a season, and the work that filled them. Before we settle in for the night, if long, quiet history like this helps you rest, a like or a subscription helps. The Long Watch reach other people who fall asleep to the past. Episodes like this one take weeks to research and assemble, and that one small tap genuinely keeps the watch going. Now get comfortable. There is no hurry in any of this. We are going to start where the planners started, with the island itself, the shape of it, the water around it, and the strip of flat ground that made anyone want it in the first place. The Caroline Islands run for about 1,000 miles across the western Pacific, just north of the equator, and at their far western end, the end nearest the Philippines, sits a group called the Palaus, 100 or 200 islands, depending on how you count one, almost all of them lying inside a single encircling reef. One island holds more land than all the others together. Babelthuap, 20 miles long and 5 across, with ground rising to 800 feet under rainforest. The administrative center was not there but on a much smaller island alongside. Koror, which the official account calls a pleasant little town. Before the war, a few thousand Palauans and something over 15,000 Japanese settlers lived in the group. Japan had taken the German holdings in the group in 1914 and held them afterward under a mandate from the League of Nations. In 1935, Japan left the League and went on administering the islands anyway. What was being built there was not a thing outsiders could learn. In 1923, a Marine lieutenant colonel named Earl Ellis, traveling alone in the guise of a trader, died at Koror under circumstances that were never established. After that, the group was, for practical purposes, closed. Near the southern end of it lies Peleliu. It is about 6 miles long and a little over 2 miles across at its widest, and both official accounts describe it shaped the same way: a lobster's claw. The long arm runs up to the north. The short arm runs out to the southeast, and between the two are shoals and swamp. The rest of the island and the wide part, the part with the airfield, is flat. Around it is the reef, and the reef decides everything else. A fringing reef is a shelf of coral, living and dead, that grows outward from the shore, and off Peleliu's western side that shelf is broad and very shallow, and much wider in the north than in the south. Its outer edge stands higher than its inner edge, and is littered with boulders. No ship of any size can cross it. The beaches beyond are coarse coral sand, firmest when wet, rough and rubbly, with a good deal of broken coral lying about, and in the autumn the surf on that side is light to moderate. The island itself is ocean floor, coral that grew across a very long time and was then pushed up out of the water by pressure from below. South of the airfield, the ground is flat enough that the first joint intelligence study described the whole island as low and flat. And for the southern half, that was nearly true. On Tarawa, which was also called low and flat, the highest point stood about 20 feet above high water. North of the airfield there was high ground, and the phrase covered that too. The airfield lay in the middle of the flat ground, two hard-surfaced runways crossing each other, rolled coral rather than concrete, with taxiways, dispersal areas, and turning circles, and length enough for bombers as well as fighters. Immediately north of the strip stood the establishment that went with it: barracks, hangars, machine shops, a powerhouse, a radio station, large water cisterns, and a two-story administration building of a type already seen on developed Japanese air bases elsewhere. From the village of Aishus beside the field, the island's whole road net spread outward. Two roads ran north up the long arm, one along each side of the high ground, and met where the ground briefly flattened. From there, a single road went on to the northern tip, where a phosphate crusher stood, and a hand-pushed tramway ran down to the water. The climate is equatorial, and the seasons are monotonously alike. The mean monthly temperature is rarely below 80 degrees, and rarely above 82, and the relative humidity sits at 82% and stays there. In the autumn, there are 18 to 20 wet days a month, 3 heavy thunderstorms, and a standing possibility of typhoon. What makes it hard on people is not the heat by itself. It is the wet air, which the official history calls most discomforting and debilitating. Peleliu has no rivers and no lakes. Apart from a few swamps, the ground takes a heavy rain and is dry again within hours, the water going straight down through the coral. What people on the island drank was rain they had caught and kept in cisterns. Overhead, cloud cover averages between 4 and 6/10, and fog is rare. The island was almost always visible from the air, and that is the reason the photographs were believed. What the photographs showed was green. Dense scrub forest covered most of the island with wild coconut palms. Mixed through it west and south of the airfield. Along the shore the growth was thick, and at the northeastern beaches it became mangrove swamp. The soil over the coral limestone is thin, and nothing tall grows in it. The first systematic coverage came on the 30th and 31st of March, 1944, when a fast carrier force struck the Palos and photographed them in passing. Through July and August, more flights went in on request from the carriers and from Army fields in New Guinea, shooting vertical and oblique. In late June, a submarine, the Seawolf, lay off the island for 6 days and photographed through her periscope every stretch of coast where a landing might be made. Complete as that coverage was, the monograph says, it fell short of entire adequacy. The map they were issued was drawn at 1 to 20,000, with sections blown up larger for the officers who would be on the ground. It was a good map, and good almost everywhere on the island. On the photographs, the ground north of the airfield read as a gently rounded hill, lying north and south above the flat. On the northwestern peninsula, the photographs found nothing. Not a single defensive installation of any importance was spotted there. Although everything learned about the Japanese elsewhere indicated there were doubtless many, there was never any question in the minds of the division planners. One of them wrote afterward that the high ground north of the airfield was the key terrain feature of the island. They knew where to look, They looked, and the picture came back empty. Someone thought that worth checking afterward. The division's senior photographic interpreter, a captain named Jerome Foley, formed 2 teams whose whole job was to go to each captured position as it fell, photograph it, sketch it, describe it, and lay beside the description the aerial photograph on which that position was supposed to have been recognized. The comparison ran to a book of its own, published under the title Peleliu, Its Terrain and Defenses. It could only be made from the ground, and it could only be made later. The island had been photographed from the air, from the water, and from under the water, and the reason for all of it had little to do with what stood on the ground there. It had to do with position. The Palaus lie about 500 miles east of Mindanao, which is to say directly on the flank of any force approaching the Philippines from the southeast. They were also too far from any American base, existing or possible, to be held down from the air or the sea for any length of time. What the American command actually knew about the group before the spring of 1944 would not have filled a folder. There were no coast watchers on the Palaus, and none of the ordinary sources of earlier campaigns. The best single item the Office of Naval Intelligence held was a pre-war photograph of the pier where phosphate was loaded on Ongor, and the caption under it in the official monograph calls it typical of what was available. In January of 1944, a Marine general passing through Pearl Harbor found the planning section of the Pacific Ocean Area staff already well along on a study for the assault of Babalthuap, the big island in the north of the group. He also noticed which beach they had chosen. It was the same one used in a Marine Corps schools problem back in the 1930s. Nothing newer had come in since. The Palaus became a definite objective on the 12th of March, 1944, in a revision of the Pacific timetable that moved every date forward. The instruction to Admiral Nimitz came down to a single line: occupy the Marianas Palaus line. Until that document, the Western Carolines had not been on the schedule at all. In May, the operation acquired a plan and a name. The Joint Staff Study, revised and issued on the 10th of May, called it Stalemate. Code names that year were drawn from a list and were not meant to describe anything, and both official histories note the coincidence without claiming it was more than that. The landing date in that first study was the 15th of September. The preliminary order of the 29th of May was larger. It called for taking the whole Palau group, 4 assault divisions in 2 corps, 1 corps landing on Peleliu and Angkor in the south, while the other went ashore on Babalthuap, an operation bigger than Saipan, bigger than Guam, and nearly the size of both together. Then, on the 13th of June, the Joint Chiefs of Staff asked a question of their own. They put it to both Pacific commands: could the war be shortened by moving every date forward, or by skipping chosen objectives altogether? Halmahera, the Western Carolines, even the Philippines, and going straight for Formosa or for Japan. 2 headquarters answered no. 1 officer went on record in advance with yes, and that was Halsey. The reasons for answering no were practical. The garrison on Babalthuap was put at over 25,000 men, and reports through early July said it was still growing. Saipan, smaller and less broken, had taken 3 divisions in 25 days. And in the south of the group, well away from that garrison, sat Peleliu, with a finished hard-surfaced airfield on flat open ground, which meant the thing could be done without touching the big island at all. On the 7th of July, the order was rewritten to say exactly that. Babalthuap came out of the plan. Stalemate 2 divided the work into 2 phases. Phase 1 was the southern Palaus, Peleliu, and Angkor, with the Big Island and Koror merely neutralized on the 15th of September, the same day as the landing at Morotai. Phase 2 was Yap and the atoll of Ulithi. The date had moved 3 times before it settled. The chain of command ran downward from Admiral William Halsey, who had the operation as a whole, through Vice Admiral Theodore Wilkinson, who had the ships, to Major General Julian Smith of the Marine Corps, who had the expeditionary troops, every man who would set foot on land. Rear Admiral George Fort had the Peleliu Group. Under them, Major General Roy Geiger had the 3rd Amphibious Corps, and under Geiger, Major General William Rupertus had the 1st Marine Division, and the island itself. In the middle of August, with Guam finished, Geiger came back from the Marianas and took over the landing force from Julian Smith, who moved up to the level above. When the force sailed, that whole vertical was distributed across 3 hulls of the same formation, the purpose-built command ship Mount McKinley, carrying Fort, Geiger, and Julian Smith with the senior staffs. A transport fitted out rather sketchily as an auxiliary command ship, carrying Rupertus and the division staff. A third carrying the assistant division commander and the rest. By the count of the official history, Stalemate 2 was the largest naval amphibious undertaking mounted in the Pacific to that date. 800 ships and craft, 1,600 aircraft, an estimated 250,000 men of the Navy, the Army, and the Marine Corps. The landing forces themselves came to about 49,500 men, and everything they would need had to go across the beaches. Even before it sailed, the 1st Marine Division was equipping itself for something other than a fight on open ground. In the 2nd week of September, the fast carriers went out ahead of the landing. On the 12th, 13th, and 14th, instead of striking Mindanao again, they turned on the central Philippines and flew 2,400 sorties against the airfields of the Visayas, standing in close enough to see the mountains of Samar. What came back was almost no resistance at all. Halsey reported to Nimitz that the enemy's non-aggressive attitude was, in his phrase, unbelievable and fantastic. On the 13th of September, he sent Nimitz 3 recommendations to be passed to the Joint Chiefs. That stalemate be cancelled immediately, that the troops already loaded for it be turned over to General MacArthur, and that MacArthur revise his own plans and go into the Philippines at the earliest possible moment. The Palau and Yap Ulithi operations, the dispatch said, were not necessary to the seizure of the Philippines. Nimitz answered that with the commitments already made, Phase 1 would go through as planned, and Phase 2 would be submitted to immediate review. That was the whole of the reply. 2 days remained, and the ships were at sea. The rest happened after the landing had begun. On the 15th, the Joint Chiefs were sitting at a conference in Quebec when a message came in from MacArthur's headquarters, sent over his name while he kept radio silence aboard a cruiser off Morotai, because a decision was needed and there was no way to reach him, offering to strike at Leyte 2 months early if the Corps held for Phase 2 were handed over at once. The Joint Chiefs approved it in 90 minutes. That Corps, which had got as far as Eniwetok, sailed right out of the plan and out of the theater. There was never a single moment when someone weighed the doubt and decided to proceed anyway. The plan had been argued since March, cut down once, renamed once, and moved 3 times, and by the middle of September, the commitments were made and the ships were loaded. The men who were going to open the door were off the beach before anyone had finished asking whether it was locked. The division chosen for the job had been in the Pacific longer than any other. On the 7th of August, 1942, the 1st Marine Division went ashore on Guadalcanal in the first American ground offensive of the Pacific War. On the 26th of December, 1943, it landed at Cape Gloucester on New Britain and stayed through the northwest monsoon, where 9 inches of rain could fall inside a single day. When New Britain was finished, it was pulled back to Pavuvu in the Russell Islands in the late spring of 1944. Pavuvu is a small island about 60 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. It had been picked from the air, and from the air it looked like what it had been before the war. A coconut plantation. On the ground it was 3 years of unharvested plantation. Tons of rotting coconuts and fallen fronds in heaps under the palms, and a smell that men who lived there remembered for the rest of their lives. The camp settled into the arithmetic of a rest area that was not quite a rest area. Fresh meat came about once a week, fresh eggs twice in 4 months, and otherwise it was Spam and dehydrated potatoes twice a day. Abandoned cattle were found on the islands nearby, and the division built a slaughterhouse until the Australian authorities asked that the reverse Lend-Lease enterprise be shut down. There was one show, Bob Hope's, squeezed in before the division sailed. Training was worse than the food. The cleared ground was so tight that units the size of a battalion ran into their own tent pegs and field kitchens while maneuvering. The artillery had no inland to fire into, so it registered out over the water with observers sitting in a boat. Everything the division would have to do at Peleliu had to be practiced where none of it existed. The men were a mixture. By the end of July, 4,860 replacements had arrived, enough to relieve a little more than half of those who had been overseas 2 years. Roughly a third of the division had 2 years in the combat zone and 2 campaigns behind them. Another third had 1 year and 1 campaign. The rest were new. Its commander was Major General William Rupertus, commissioned in 1913. In the First War, he commanded a ship's detachment. Between the wars, he served in Haiti and in China. At Guadalcanal, he was the assistant division commander. He took the division itself for Cape Gloucester, and he had it now. The warning order reached Pavuvu on the 2nd of June, and Rupertus was not there to receive it. He and his chief of staff, Colonel John Selden, were in Washington arguing for replacements. Brigadier General Oliver Smith, the assistant division commander, put the staff to work at once on 2 different schemes of maneuver, so that whichever way the decision went there would be a plan under it. Rupertus came back on the 21st of June and approved one of them. He wanted 2 regiments ashore and 1 afloat in reserve. General Julian Smith recommended 3 regiments landing abreast. General Roy Geiger settled it, 3 regiments abreast, and the only reserve a single battalion landing team belonging to the division itself. Rupertus preferred not to depend on Army units, and he made that preference plain during the planning. In the Marine Corps, a regiment is spoken of simply by its number. The 1st Marines went in under Colonel Louis Puller, the 5th Marines under Colonel Harold Harris, the 7th Marines under Colonel Herman Hannikin, each built up into a combat team with its own engineers and guns. Counting the Corps troops attached to it, the division would carry a little over 28,000 men to the island. The plan called for 248 amphibian tractors, LVTs, the tracked machines that would have to swim the reef. When the division reached Pavuvu, there were 48, more than half of them waiting for parts. In the middle of June, 40 landing craft came over from Tulagi, formally surveyed, which is to say, written off. There was nothing else. So the division trained on those and cut the crew of each tractor from 3 men to 2, because there were not enough men to go around. A whole battalion of armored amphibians had to be raised from nothing. Lieutenant Colonel Kimber Boyer, who had been running motor transport, was given 36 officers and 800 enlisted men, of whom about 50 had ever fought in the machine they were meant to fight in. For the first 10 days, he had 3 officers altogether, and one of his company commanders knew the vehicle from a photograph in an intelligence publication. Late in the summer, word came that the rest of his machines would arrive, carrying 75mm howitzers, instead of the guns his crews had learned. Boyer wrote afterward that it would insult a military reader to call the battalion sufficiently trained. Loading was done at 5 widely separated places: Puvuvu, Panica, Guadalcanal, Tulagi, Espiritu Santo, and by the 31st of August every ship was loaded in the order the fighting would need them. A complete issue of new radio batteries turned up almost entirely dead after its last inspection, and was replaced the same day. On the 27th of August, the force rehearsed off Tassafaronga, on Guadalcanal. There is no coral reef there, so they invented one, a transfer line drawn on the water at the right distance from the beach, where the boats of the later wave stopped and passed their men to LVTs coming back out. It went smoothly until the command post tried to reach its regiments. The telephone worked. The radios were useless, the new sets having arrived too late to be tuned and sighted properly. That was fixed, and the second rehearsal 2 days later went so well that the critique produced almost nothing, because everybody was satisfied with everybody. Somewhere in those practice landings, stepping down from an amphibian tractor, Rupertus fell and broke his ankle. On the day of the first rehearsal, Geiger came to the division command post, learned that the commanding general could not go ashore, and said he was concerned. Oliver Smith gave his assurance that in the 2 weeks remaining the ankle would mend enough. The slow group sailed from Guadalcanal early on the 4th of September. The fast transports followed on the 8th. The course ran northwest through the Solomons, across the equator, then along the northern coast of New Guinea, about 2,100 miles. The sea stayed smooth the whole way, and the passage was uneventful and thoroughly uncomfortable, as passages in the tropics are. Before the ships left Guadalcanal, every landing force commander and each of the 36 accredited war correspondents was handed a sealed envelope, with orders not to open it until the day before the landing. On the morning of the 14th of September, off the Palaus, the envelopes were opened. The letter inside said the division commander expected the operation to be very tough and very short, comparable to Tarawa, and that Peleliu should be secured within 4 days. 4 days. That was the number in the envelope. Most of the officers read it as a pep talk and put it away. It did not read that way to the correspondents. Many of them never came ashore at all, and only 6 stayed through the first critical days. The number itself was not pulled out of the air. It rested on the weight of naval gunfire and bombing scheduled to fall on the island first, and on the assumption that whatever was down there would be under it. On the island ahead of them, men had been working since April, and not on the surface. On the other side of the water, the work had started earlier. In September of 1943, Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo drew a second line across its own map, west of the Marianas and the Carolines, and called what lay inside it the zone of absolute defense. The Palau sat on that line. The order that came down was plain on paper: secure the Palau Islands and the Yap area. Hold them to the very last as the final position barring the enemy from the Pacific. Fortify Peleliu and Ungor as an airbase. At the end of March 1944, American carriers spent 2 days over the Palaus and finished them as a fleet anchorage. Whatever the islands were worth after that, they were worth as ground and as airfields. That spring the reinforcement came. Troops were pulled out of the Kwantung Army in Manchuria and sent south, and the 14th Division took over the defense of the group. One account has the premier himself giving the order, in Tokyo, that spring, hold the Palaus as long as possible and make them expensive. Only one of the 4 official histories tells it that way, and it names General Hideki Tojo, who was war minister as well as premier. The others describe the same decision without the meeting and without a signature. The shape of it is not in dispute. The islands were to be reinforced and sold dearly. Its commander was Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue, who held both the division and the Palau sector group, a command reaching out to Yap and Ulithi. His headquarters was on Koror, to the north, not on Peleliu. Peleliu went to Colonel Kunio Nakagawa of the 2nd Infantry, reinforced, who came to the island in April and was given the Peleliu sector. Every captured order from that island down to the last weeks of the fighting carries his name. There was one complication in that arrangement, and Inoue solved it with a general. Major General Kenjiro Murai was sent to Peleliu, senior to Nakagawa by 2 grades, but not placed over him. He was there as insurance, Inoue said afterward, and to give the army rank enough to match the Navy, whose garrison on the island was commanded by a flag officer, Vice Admiral Itu. Peleliu talked to Koror by an undersea telephone cable. The call sign at both ends was Sakura, the name of a Japanese town, used the way an American switchboard might use Denver. There was no radio link between the island and the headquarters at the start. 1 cable on the sea floor, and a voice at either end of it. On the 11th of July, 1944, a document was issued at group headquarters over Inoue's signature. It was called Palau Sector Group Training for Victory, and it was not an inspirational paper. It applied recent battle lessons, it said, especially those of Saipan. Its stated goal was to reduce losses in the enemy's heavy naval and aerial bombardment before a landing. Reserves were to move forward at a crawl, using terrain, natural objects, and shell holes. Strength was not to be spent quickly. Strong points were to cover the airfields to the last moment. For 2 years, the answer to an American landing had been the waterline. Meet them at the beach and break the landing in the first hours. That answer had failed 3 times running, and this order replaced it. The beaches at Peleliu would still be mined and covered by fire, heavily, but the weight of the defense would wait inland on the high ground, in positions that shelling could not destroy, because they were not on the surface to begin with. Nothing was to be decided in the first hours. The digging had 2 authors, and they were not working together. The Navy had a construction battalion and a tunneling unit, and built mostly in the north. Galleries about 10 feet wide and 6 high, with separate rooms for stores, quarters, and medical use. Some wired for electric light, ventilated, floored with wood. Those were shelters from bombing, meant to keep men alive under aircraft, and not meant to be fought from with infantry at the entrance. The army caves were plainer and less well engineered, and they were built for a long ground fight. They ran on 2 or more levels, offset so a hit on one did not open the other, with several entrances into one system and winding passages between them. Entrances were masked and still kept their fields of fire. Inside, water dripping from the ceiling was led along cut channels into troughs, and food and ammunition were packed into every niche and crack in the coral. Most of it was done with hand tools and dynamite, in coral that had to be broken rather than dug. Islanders questioned after the war remembered the Army working at it furiously from April through September. There is one count of the result. The official Marine Corps account puts the number at about 500 caves, tunnels, and firing embrasures. Nobody ever walked that ground with a clipboard and confirmed it. The beaches were prepared as a first line and not as the main one. Along the southwestern shore, where the landing was expected, more than 300 anti-boat mines were laid in belts, and aerial bombs were rigged as charges along the routes inland. Anti-tank ditches were cut roughly parallel to the water. Casemates of reinforced concrete faced with coral held guns sighted to fire along the beach rather than out to sea. One blockhouse carried as many as 16 automatic weapons positions covering one another. The strongest single defensive system on the island was not on those beaches at all. It stood at a beach called Purple, where the reef was nowhere more than 200 yards across, and craft could come closer in than anywhere else. The ground had been read correctly. The Americans declined it for a reason that had nothing to do with the guns. Behind Purple lay a mangrove swamp that squeezed the way inland to a single road in two places. What Nakagawa had was a garrison of roughly 10,500, some 6,000 of them combat troops. The Corps was his own regiment, reinforced, with it a battalion from another infantry regiment, a battalion of an independent mixed brigade, engineers, signalmen, naval combat and construction troops, and the air base personnel of Peleliu and of Ngesebus, the small island off the northern tip. There were between 13 and 15 light tanks. The island was cut into 4 defensive sectors, each held by a reinforced battalion, with one more in reserve. Angkor, to the south, was a separate command and did not answer to Nakagawa at all. To the north, on Babelthuap and the islands around it, something over 25,000 Japanese troops remained within reach of Peleliu, among them sea transport units, some trained for putting men ashore against opposition. On the American planning charts, that number was the reason the operation had a time limit at all. Inoue made one large mistake and named it himself after the war. He was convinced Peleliu would only be a step, that the Americans would come on to Koror and Babelthuap next, and so he held back reinforcements and ammunition for the fight he expected later. He also said plainly that with a year instead of 6 months, he believed he could have thrown the landing back. The Americans knew the numbers almost exactly. Records captured from the 31st Army headquarters on Saipan gave them the order of battle of the Palau garrisons before the operation, and a check afterward found it wrong by 3 minor units. What the files did not give them was the rest. Nothing in the planning papers shows any American knowledge of the 11th of July order. On the 8th of September, Inoue still thought the carrier strikes might be a feint aimed somewhere else. On the 11th, he stopped thinking so, and told his command to prepare for a defense to the end. On the 12th, the first battleship shells came down on an island that had spent 5 months being taken apart from the inside. The work of taking that island apart began 3 days before anyone set foot on it. And most of it was planned a very long way away. The division had never operated in the Central Pacific before. It had no naval gunfire officer of its own, no man on the staff whose whole profession was matching ships' guns to points on a map, and the target information for its fire plan had to come from Fleet Marine Force Pacific Headquarters in Honolulu. where the staff was still busy with the Marianas. A Navy lieutenant was flown out from Pearl Harbor at the last minute to fill the billet. On the beach, when the calls for fire started coming, he was very good. During the planning, that chair had been empty. There was also the matter of what there was to shoot. Guam had been bombarded for 13 days that summer, and the shortage of ammunition that long shelling created could not be fully made good in the short interval between the two operations. Peleliu would be prepared with what was left in the magazines, and every shell in them had been counted twice before the fire support group ever sighted the island. The first plan allowed 2 days of bombardment. The general commanding the corps thought 2 days were not enough and asked for 4. He was given 3 for Peleliu and 5 for Angkor. The extra day was real, and it changed the tempo. The ships could work more deliberately, with longer pauses between rounds. But it did not add a single pound of metal to the total. The same allowance was simply spread across more hours. At 5:30 on the morning of the 12th of September, the guns opened. 5 old battleships, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, standing off a coral island 6 miles long. 2 hours of naval gunfire, then 2 hours of aircraft over the target, then the ships again, the whole formation zigzagging along the coast between salvos. That pattern ran for 3 days. The admiral commanding the fire had 4 officers on his staff. The establishment of a cruiser division, and during the bombardment, all of them but one were on the sick list. He had no command ship with modern communications, of the kind that had been available in earlier operations. 6 years later, writing about the problem of shooting at an island whose defenses no one had located, he put the method in one flat sentence: the best that can be done is to blast away at suspected positions and hope for the best. Nothing came back. In 3 days of shelling, not one gun on the island fired at the ships. There was no muzzle flash to mark, nothing to indicate that anything down there was still capable of shooting. A dense pall of smoke hung over Peleliu like a shroud. A Japanese soldier's diary, translated later, described the island afterward as a barren wasteland, and from 4 miles out at sea, that is exactly what it looked like. The fire did do things. It flattened most of what stood above ground: barracks, hangars, administrative buildings, the larger guns sighted in the open, though aircraft had already damaged much of that. It stripped the vegetation off the northwestern ridges and showed, for the first time, the true shape of the ground under the green, opening caves whose existence nobody had suspected. Below that line, almost nothing changed. The artillery was underground, some of it behind steel doors that rolled shut. The infantry was in shelters, and when the fire moved on, they came out of them whole. Both sides had worked out in advance what a bombardment could do, and they had arrived at different answers. One side was counting tons. The other had written its answer down months earlier, in an order, and its answer was that naval and aerial gunfire has limits, and that a man in the ground is a very small thing to hit. On the evening of the 14th, the day before the landing, the admiral told the attack force commander that he had run out of targets. The last of the scheduled preparation was never fired. No text of that signal survives in any of the official accounts. Only the fact of it, passed in plain voice and remembered afterward by the men who heard it. On the division staff, the reaction was disbelief. They had submitted a study and requirements and asked for particular things by name and by map coordinate. Over the 3 days before the landing, the ships fired more than 2,000 tons of shells into that island. By the time the first wave touched the beach, the figure was higher still. Here is what the report meant on the ground. At a conference aboard the flagship shortly before the landing, Colonel Puller asked that naval gunfire be put on a small piece of high ground flanking his landing beach, even though the photographs showed no enemy positions on it at all. He asked for it by name. The record kept by one of his battalions notes that the entire point and its defenses were untouched by naval gunfire, and that the length of the beach beside it had been only moderately damaged. The colonel commanding the 5th Marines made a similar request about a small unnamed island lying just south of the right-hand beach, an obvious place from which to fire down the length of the reef. He wanted heavy fire put on it. He wrote afterward that during the entire run from the ship to the shore, he never saw a single sign that anything of ours had landed on that target. Then there was the blockhouse. One large concrete blockhouse was carried on the assault maps as destroyed, and the reason it was carried as destroyed was that it was plotted precisely. Its position was known, therefore it had been shot at. Therefore, it was gone. It was found later to be entirely undamaged by naval gunfire. The admiral noted, reasonably enough, that the blockhouse did not appear on the charts he had been given. 2 other large blockhouses, also carried as destroyed, were destroyed for real by naval gunfire on call in the days after the landing. The amphibians were still crossing the reef the next morning when the hidden batteries opened on them. The admiral needed 1 sentence for that, and he wrote it in 1950. My surprise and chagrin when concealed batteries opened up on the LVTs can be imagined. The men who planned that fire and the men who came ashore under it never did agree about what it had accomplished. They were still writing each other letters about it 6 years later. 3 days of knocking, no answer from behind the door, and a conclusion drawn from the silence. Dawn on the 15th of September 1944 broke calm and clear at 8 minutes to 6. The sea was flat, the surf light, the visibility very nearly unlimited. Good enough that no request for air support was refused for weather all day. Both convoy groups had been in their transport areas since 5:15. At 5:30, the guns started again, on the schedule written for the day of the landing. Between the ships and the island lay the reef. A shelf of living coral runs all the way around Peleliu, and off the landing beaches it is 600 to 800 yards wide. Depending on where you cross it, too shallow for a boat that draws water, too deep to walk. That is why the assault went in on tractors. The LVT, the amphibian tractor, is a tracked steel box that swims out under its own power, puts its tracks on the coral, crawls across, and keeps going up onto the sand. It could do all of that. What it could not do was hurry, 800 yards at the speed of a man walking, in the open, in daylight, with the island watching. Nothing anyone did could change that. The reef had been prepared for them. Aerial bombs were laid out across it as mines, wired back to observation posts on shore, to be fired from the beach when the tractors were on top of them. The bombardment cut the wires and blinded the men who were meant to watch. On the beaches and 100 yards inland there were more mines, many improvised from bombs buried nose down, and a great majority of the naval anti-invasion mines had never been armed at all. Had they worked, one officer wrote afterward, the results would have been disastrous. At 8 o'clock, the first wave crossed the line of departure, the start line drawn on the water. Armored amphibians, the same hull with a gun and a turret, leading the infantry in. Behind them, the assault waves came on at 1-minute intervals. The supporting fire went in with them, high explosive along the beaches, white phosphorus onto the high ground north of the airfield to take the view away from whoever was up there with binoculars. Small landing craft fitted with rocket launchers ran into 1,000 yards and fired salvo after salvo. Others, mounting mortars, worked the northern flank. Then the fighter bombers came down on the sand, never fewer than 8 at once, the fire walking inland as the leading amphibians closed. The official history says it plainly. All this was as had been planned and rehearsed, a school problem. But presently the Japanese began revising the book. The guns that opened were on the ground at either end of the landing area. On 2 low headlands the photographs had shown as nothing much, and they fired down the length of the beaches and out along the reef, sideways across the line of advance. There is no cover on a coral shelf. The regimental record of the 1st Marines describes it from the water. This did not appear to be aim fire, but rather a protective curtain of some intensity, which moved shoreward with the approach of the vehicles. The smoke screen laid inland drifted back out to sea, covered the beaches and the approaches, and thinned very slowly, because there was no wind to move it. When it cleared, the observers on the ships could see a second kind of smoke, spread along the width of the reef, where the tractors were burning. At 32 minutes past 8, the first wave touched the beach, 2 minutes behind schedule. 5 infantry battalions from 3 regiments came ashore on 5 beaches. White 1 and White 2 on the left, Orange 1, Orange 2, and Orange 3 to the right. The 1st Marines on the left, the 5th Marines in the center, the 7th Marines on the right. The Shermans went in with the 4th wave, far earlier than tanks had ever gone in on a Marine landing, possible because they had been waterproofed properly, and because the underwater demolition teams had spent 3 days blasting lanes through the coral. Within half an hour of the first men reaching the sand, the infantry had full tank support. It cost something. More than half of the division's 30 tanks took between 1 and 4 hits during the 10 minutes of the crossing. On the right, the reef was so cluttered with obstacles that the tractors had to pick their way in column instead of coming on line, which made them slower and easier to hit. The battalion split down the middle on the water. Major Hurst, commanding the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, came ashore on Orange 2 with half his command post and half his men, and his executive officer landed with the rest at the southern tip of Orange 3, for a time the right-hand end of the entire division front, connected to nobody. What put the battalion back together was a ditch. A long anti-tank ditch ran just behind the right-hand beach, across the whole width of the battalion zone. Nobody had known it was there until a support plane spotted it minutes before the first wave touched. The 2 halves of the battalion dropped into it, met in the middle, and climbed out to keep going inland. Major Hurst called it an excellent artery for moving troops. Oliver Smith came ashore around 11:30 and put the forward command post of the division in that same ditch. In the center it went faster. By 9:30, 2 battalions were 350 yards inland, on the first line marked for the day, through scrub thick enough to lose the man beside you. Late in the afternoon, a battalion of the 5th Marines, following a counterattack that had failed in front of it, pushed almost to the middle of the airfield. On the left, the division's flank had caught on a point of rock, and what was happening out there stayed unclear for the rest of the day. The count of what the reef cost never settled. The division's own report listed 26 amphibian tractors destroyed. An air observer at one moment counted 38 of them burning at the same time. The men who had commanded the assault waves put the number knocked out, at least temporarily, at above 60. Crews were extremely reluctant to write off a machine that might yet be recovered, and from 3,000 feet one tracked hull looks much like another. At 4:25, the fire coming into the beachhead increased sharply. At 5:15, the companies on the right dug in where they stood. The 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had by then stopped functioning as one organization. The regiment's executive officer, Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Walt, took it over and went out with a single runner to find his companies one at a time in the dark, until the line was tied together and reporting by 10:30. By nightfall, the beachhead was 3,000 yards across the front and averaged 500 yards deep. The averages describe nothing north of Orange 2. The line was nowhere more than 300 yards inland. Artillery was ashore and ranged in. Colonel Nakagawa's report for the day said his forces had thrown the landing back at 2 points, and that at one beach the enemy had got ashore with tanks. The optimism that evening was not confined to one side of the reef. By the end of the first day, the division had lost 1,111 men, of whom about 210 were dead. The count taken that same evening was a different number, because counts taken that same evening always are. And out on the left, past the end of White One, on a low shelf of coral that pushes a few dozen yards into the sea, a rifle company had been out of reach since the middle of the morning, and it would stay out of reach. At the left-hand end of the landing beaches, the shoreline turned a corner. A shelf of coral stood there, rising some 30 feet above the water and pushing out about 25 yards to seaward, just past the boundary of the last beach on the left. It was solid jagged rock, sharp pinnacles, deep crevasses, great boulders, and into the base of the drop below it, and into the rock above it, the garrison had blasted chambers and poured concrete. The Marines called it the Point. Its guns faced the beaches. Fire from that corner ran the whole length of the 2 beaches on the left, along the waterline, into the men and the machines coming out of the water. It was also the hinge. The plan had the 1st Marines swinging north across the island once ashore, and the corner was the pivot. The job went to Company K of the 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines. Its commander was Captain George Hunt, who had been at Guadalcanal and on New Britain, and who in civilian life wrote for a living. Before the landing, he built a plan in which every element of the company had one described job, and rehearsed it until each man knew not only his own part, but where that part fitted. His own view of it was plain. Whatever else broke down that morning, this could not. If the corner was not taken and held, the regimental beach lay open to fire from the flank. This was the corner Puller had asked for by name, and on the morning of the 15th there was no sign that the guns had touched it. 5 reinforced pillboxes of concrete and steel stood there, one holding a 47mm gun, 4 of them heavy machine guns, with rifle pits and coral slits around them. At about 8:30, the assault platoons came ashore roughly 100 yards to the right of where they were meant to be. The fire from the corner was laid along the beach, which meant the corner could not be taken from the beach at all. The company had to go inland first and then turn back on it from the landward side. It attacked inland and began its turn north with 2 platoons in front. The platoon on the left came within 50 yards of the point and stopped. The other went 75 yards straight ahead and dropped into an anti-tank ditch, where it was caught by fire from the north end of a long coral ridge, 30 to 40 feet high, standing 100 yards in from the water. That ridge was on no aerial photograph and on no map issued to the regiment. Before long, each assault platoon was down to about the strength of a squad, and they had lost contact with each other. Hunt put in his support platoon. The fight ran nearly 2 hours. The main work of it was a concrete casemate set into the base of the drop to the beach, holding the gun that had fired along the sand all morning, and it was taken from above rather than from in front. Lieutenant Willis dropped a smoke grenade before the embrasure to cover the approach. Corporal Anderson put a rifle grenade through the slit. The gun stopped firing. By 10:15, the point belonged to Company K, what Hunt had left of his 2 platoons. He set in a circle facing inland, and a Japanese machine gun taken on the position went into that circle, pointed back the way its owners had come. His 3rd platoon was still pinned in the ditch behind him. The count of enemy dead reported from the corner that morning was 110. The corner was now the strongest ground on that flank, and also the loneliest, the sea at the back of it, and everything else in front. Behind him the line had come apart. In the turn, a gap had opened between the company and the rest of the battalion, and the defenders found it quickly and put troops into it in strength. Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Sabol, commanding the battalion, spent what he had: 2 platoons of Company L, then his last reserve platoon. It was not enough. The regiment sent Company A, which went in and was held there by fire from the ridge on its right, and late in the day, Company B took its place. By dark, the gap was narrower and still open. Puller built a second line across the corridor between the ridge and the sea, out of what was left of his regimental reserve. His headquarters people, and 100 men of the 1st Engineer Battalion. Had a heavy blow come down that corridor in the night, it would have come out on beaches stacked with men, equipment, and the cargo of the later waves. It did not come. The official histories give the reason the same short way. The garrison's communications were broken, and its plans had not provided for a counterattack there. What the division knew that evening was less than that. When a telephone line was finally run into the regimental command post, the report that went up was that the regiment was firmly established on the beach and held approximately the objective line. It mentioned no gaps, no heavy losses, no need of help, and the man who made it did not have a clear picture either. Puller had as yet no definite idea of his own casualties. 5 amphibian tractors carrying his headquarters people and his communications had been knocked out on the reef that morning. Afterwards, a shell came into the command post. A runner got through during the day, but he had been caught in the fighting on the way in and arrived too shaken to give an account of anything. The division command, the official account says, had no very clear picture of the regiment's situation for most of that day. By evening, the men who held the corner could be counted, 38 of them. 1 amphibian tractor got in just before dark, with grenades, mortar shells, and water. And the ammunition made the difference in that night. Star shells and mortar flares stood over the area for much of it. At the worst hour of the night, the number on the corner was 18, and they were leaning heavily on that captured machine gun. In the morning, a tractor came across the reef again with weapons and supplies, took men off, and later brought out the platoon that had spent the night in the ditch. That afternoon, a company of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, working with tanks, took a long piece of the Coral Ridge, and Company B moved up along it to Company K. By then, the company on the corner had been cut off for 30 hours. At 10 o'clock that night, the defenders came at the point in force. a frontal attack on the high ground and a second, smaller push along the narrow flat at the water's edge. It was the attack that had not come the night before, and it came a day late. Most of Company B was on the corner by then. The company was tied into the battalion line, and it had telephone contact with the mortar sections, registered on the ground in front. By 2 in the morning, a great quiet lay over the area. In the forenoon of the 17th, Company 1 passed through the position and Company K walked back into reserve. 235 men had come ashore with Hunt on the 15th. 78 of them walked back. The corner they had held was a few dozen yards of rock at the end of a beach, and holding it kept the flank of a division closed for 2 days. Inland from it, the ground opened out flat, and flat ground on that island had a difficulty of its own. The airfield was the only thing on Peleliu that could be seen whole. A broad open surface of coral and crushed rock, a service apron and a hangar area along its northern side, and no cover anywhere on it. Low scrub and stunted jungle closed around it to the north and east, so that the whole field sat inside the terrain like a compartment with walls. It was ideal ground for tanks. For men on foot, it was ground with nothing on it to get behind. What stood over it was the difference between this island and the atolls. North of the field, the ground went up, and there were observation posts in that rock, looking down. The official account says the men up there could look down the throats of the troops below them. The airfields taken at Betio, at Roy, at Engebe, had nothing above them at all. This one had a wall of coral at its shoulder, and every yard of the open ground was in view for as long as the light held. Observers in the caves called fire down onto the field and onto the beaches behind it, and some of the ground had been registered in advance. Beside the division command post, there was a patch about 50 yards by 150 which took, by actual count, more than 200 rounds of major caliber in a 2-hour period. The shore party working on the sand had a casualty rate close to double that of any previous operation, and the unloading never noticeably slowed. The same arrangement worked against the men in the rock. Their observation posts were scattered and not coordinated with one another, and they could not mask the fire of their heavy weapons. A position spotted from the air drew a flood of heavy fire and then aircraft, so the guns stayed in the caves and came out a few rounds at a time. On the afternoon of the landing, the fire off the ridges grew suddenly heavier, at about 25 minutes past 4. That was the first sign. At about 10 minutes to 5, infantry came out on the northern edge of the field, a company or so, and started across the open toward the marine line, using every dip and every shell hole on the way over. From behind the ridges, light tanks came out in 2 columns. About half of them carried men on the outside, tied on. It came at the boundary between the 1st and the 5th Marines, into the ground held by the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and that was the part of the front best prepared for exactly this. Colonel Harold Harris, commanding the 5th Marines, had ordered his 37mm anti-tank guns, and his heavy machine guns landed with the assault waves and set up on the objective line as soon as it was taken. The battalion's tanks stood in defilade, tucked behind a fold of ground where they could not be seen, but could still fire out in front of their own infantry. The tanks came on faster than the infantry with them could follow and left them behind, and the officer commanding them took the only course still open and drove straight in at speed. Major John Gustafson, in the forward command post of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, out in the middle of the field, put his own tank platoon in, although nothing had yet come into his zone. Accounts differ as to who hit what. Within a few minutes it was over, and before dark, the whole attack was finished. More than 100 tanks were reported destroyed. That figure, of course, reflected the amount of fire directed their way. Every man with a rocket launcher, every anti-tank crew, and every tank commander believed he had hit the machine he had fired at, and reported it so. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Marines, moved up behind the wreckage and spent that night in the middle of the open airfield. It was the deepest advance made anywhere in the division that day, and it had been made across ground that could be seen from the ridges above. At 8 the next morning, the division attacked all along its front after half an hour of air and naval fire, and the 5th Marines moved their command post to the edge of the field, into a captured zigzag communication trench with no earth banked around it. A captured map showed later what that trench had been to the men who dug it: a registration point for a battery. 15 or 20 rounds came in that morning, and 2 of them did all the work. The regiment lost several of its staff officers in a minute, and its commander was almost completely buried, came out with a badly damaged knee, and refused to leave the island. That day the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, went up the northern length of the airfield with 2 companies abreast, and in a little over an hour its leading elements were at the service apron on the far side. There was no holding it overnight. The battalion walked back to the anti-tank ditch, crossed the same ground again the next morning, and that time held what it had crossed. The thermometer on the 2nd day stood at 105 in the shade, and in most of the places where the fighting was there was very little shade and no wind at all. Temperatures well above 110 were recorded. The coral soaked up heat all day and gave it back after dark, so that the night was only slightly cooler than the afternoon. Rain came at intervals and brought no relief. A correspondent who was there wrote that the men were in the finest physical condition possible, and that on Peleliu they wilted. Water turned out to be easy to find and hard to drink. The engineers learned that a productive well could be sunk almost anywhere on the low ground, and near the beach a shallow hole scooped in the sand filled with what the official account calls only slightly disagreeable liquid, drinkable once a halazone tablet had gone in. But the units up front were supplied from behind, and what came up came in steamed-out oil drums. The steaming did not get all the oil out. The water smelled of it and tasted of it, and a good many of the men who drank it were made ill. When the captains of the transports offshore heard about the drums and about the shortage, they sent crates of fruit and fruit juice into the beach in a hurry, and that helped. At 24 minutes past 1 on the 2nd afternoon, the commander of the 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, sent his regiment a message of 3 words: out of water. His attack had stopped, and it had not been stopped by the defenders. Later, when the fighting had closed around the high ground, the men up there still had a clear look at the southern end of the island, and parts of it were still within mortar range of the airfield. They hardly used it, committed to holding as long as possible. Colonel Nakagawa seems to have judged that uncovering a well-hidden position for a gesture was not worth what it cost, and kept his ammunition for closer targets. So the work on the runways went on in plain sight of men who were watching it and not shooting at it. Down on the flat, that looked like relief. Up ahead where the ground rose, it was not. Once the fighting went into the ridges, country hard to move over with nobody shooting at all. The number of men going out of the line climbed so sharply that a call went out to every ship lying off the island. asking each to collect every salt tablet aboard and send it in. The tablets were for one regiment. They were for the 1st Marines. The officers who planned the operation had a map, and it was a good one. It was printed and gridded and issued down to the companies, and it was accurate almost everywhere on the island. In the one place that decided the campaign, it was wrong. Not in its outlines, which were right, but in what it said the ground was shaped like. A topographic engineer battalion had drawn it from the summer's aerial coverage, one sheet at 20,000 to 1, with a grid of numbered targets over it, and enlargements for the men who would be walking on it. It showed the high ground as a single ridge system, more or less continuous, running 2/3 the length of the peninsula, with a serviceable road down either side. That is a shape a plan can be built on, and a plan was built on it. 4 phase lines across the island, and an advance from south to north. What the cameras could not see was what lay under the brush. The soil on Peleliu is a thin skin over coral, and it holds a low tangled scrub, enough from the air to blur an outline and soften a contour. The official Marine Corps history says the preliminary photography had done scant justice to the formation. The scrub cloaked the high ground so that the place might have passed for pleasantly undulating country of hills and dales. The charts had guessed at 260 feet. The highest ground turned out to be 300, and it went up almost straight. Then the disguise came off in 3 days. The naval bombardment before the landing took the vegetation off the high ground like a scythe, and the real shape came out from underneath. Men ashore on the 15th of September could look north and see something that had never been on any photograph. On the 17th, the 1st Marines walked into it. Peleliu is a piece of the ocean floor in a thick coral shell, pushed up from below. Where the pressure was greatest, the shell buckled and split, and what came up was not a hill, but a maze of crests and gullies under loose rubble. The same pressure cracked the ground before it could grow tall, which is why the heights are low and the sides are sheer, and open faults through the limestone that water widened into caves at every level from the valley floors to the crests. The regiment's own narrative called it the worst ground it had met in 3 campaigns in the Pacific. A rocky spine heaved up in a contorted mass of decayed coral, strewn with rubble, crags, and gulches thrown together in a confusing maze. No roads, scarcely any trails, no secure footing even in the few level places. Oliver Smith added what the photographs had flattened. Ravines that looked steep-sided on the map had sheer cliffs for sides, 50 to 100 feet high, and the caves and pillboxes worked into the noses of the ridges covered one another. So blind spots were hard to find, and there was no digging in. The official historian put it in a footnote and said it could not be overemphasized. The impossibility of digging in any accepted sense of the term, was repeatedly the controlling factor in canceling out gains already paid for. The best a man could do was pile chunks of coral around himself. Ground on those ridges was often lost, not because it was taken back, but because there was no way to stay on it. On the 17th, in one day's advance up the center, a single battalion had to reduce 35 separate manned caves that appeared in no intelligence document anywhere. By evening, the regimental front, drawn on a map, looked like a compressed letter W. A battalion commander wrote later that there was no such thing as a continuous attacking line. Elements of the same company, even the same platoon, were attacking in every direction of the compass, and companies asked for their front lines gave points where the commander thought he had some men. That was the war the maps were describing. Some of the targets marked for the artillery preparation on the morning of the 19th of September lay behind, or directly on top of, positions the sketches showed as taken the day before. The guns and mortars opened at 6:20 that morning, the ships at 6:45, and the infantry went forward at 7. About noon, Captain Everett Pope was given a hill. He commanded a rifle company in the 1st Marines. It had come ashore 4 days earlier at something over 200 men. On the morning of the 19th, 90 were left. The hill stood above the east road at the mouth of a valley, and from below it looked like exactly what the photographs had promised. One steep rise, standing by itself. The first approach went through a swamp toward the road at its foot and stopped there, under machine gun fire from across a small pond. He was given permission to pull back and try again along the road, with tanks. The road crossed a sinkhole on a narrow causeway. The first tank slid off one side of it. The second, working to drag the first out, slid off the other, and the crossing was blocked. The company went over on foot, a squad at a time, collected at the base of the hill, and climbed it with nothing heavier behind it than mortars and machine guns. They were on the crest near dark, and the ground told them what the photographs had not. It was not a hill standing by itself. It was the nose of a long ridge, and 50 yards further on a higher knob looked down on them, and from a parallel ridge to the west, another set of positions looked across. 50 yards. That was the whole distance between a hill taken and a hill not taken, and it was on no map they were carrying. A platoon from the Division Reconnaissance Company had been sent to tie in on the right. It never quite reached the position, and the only surviving account of that night suggests the captain on the hill may not have known it was there at all. The counterattacks came in through the dark, one after another, and by morning the ammunition was gone. At first light there were 16 men still on the hill, and 8 of them were unhurt. They came down the way they had gone up, back through the swamp. Retaking that same hill was the main business of the following day. The regiment put in everything it had and kept nothing in reserve, and the low ground at the foot proved impossible to hold. What was left came back to a position from which the mouth of the valley could be watched from a respectful distance. The hill above the east road was finally taken and held on the 3rd of October by a battalion of another regiment. In the first days of that month, a mapping party from the 5th Marines went up into the ridges with sketch pads and drew the ground as it actually was. The Ummerbrogel as a whole, and inside it the 5 Sisters, the Horseshoe, Death Valley, the China Wall along the western side. It was a hurried job and unreliable about heights, but the names on it stuck, and for the first time the reports coming down from different units described the same places by the same words. The division command post was a captured anti-tank trench cut into the reverse slope of a rise a little way in from the beach, roofed and floored and furnished with field telephones. The reports came into it every evening. Positions, ammunition, casualties. Casualty returns are the slowest of the 3, because a man is counted when the paperwork catches up with him and not when he is hurt. And on Peleliu, the paperwork was several days behind the ridges. Even so, the figures coming down from one regiment had begun to say something the maps did not. On the morning of the 17th of September, before the day's attack began, the losses of the 1st Marines had passed 1,000. The battalions were thin enough that all 3 had to be put into the line at once, with nothing behind them. By that evening the count stood at 1,236. In the 3rd Battalion, of the 473 men still effective, 200 were from headquarters. The next morning, a company of the Engineer Battalion sent 115 men forward, distributed among the assault units. And on that same 18th of September, the regimental commander, Colonel Louis Puller, reported at the division command post with an optimism that the official history calls contagious. The feeling in the post was that a breakthrough was close, and that after it the defense would collapse or at worst come apart. As had happened on Saipan and Tinian and Guam once a certain point was passed. It was a reasonable thing to think, and it was wrong for reasons no one in that trench could see. On the other islands, the collapse had come when American troops reached favorable ground, and it had always been preceded by at least one attack made in the open. Neither condition existed here. There had been no such attacks, and the ground ahead was not getting better. It was getting worse. On the 19th, the light observation planes came ashore. Small unarmed aircraft that could take off from a strip of the captured airfield and loiter over the island at a few hundred feet. The commander of the 5th Marines, Colonel Harold Harris, went up in one the same day and looked down into the high ground in the center of the island. He came back convinced that the ridges would be cheaper to attack from the north than from the south, which was the direction already ordered and already being tried. And he offered the airplane to the others. The single account that records this says they answered that they had their maps. By the 4th day, the regiment in the ridges had lost about 1,500 men, and one of the official histories fixes the moment there. A regiment in name only. Underneath the regimental figure was a smaller one. In the 9 rifle platoons of the 3 rifle companies of the 1st Battalion, 74 men were left, and not one of the platoon leaders they had started with. The battalion's own history records what was done about it on the 20th. The intelligence section, the cooks, the jeep drivers, and the general duty men of headquarters company were organized into machine gun platoons under the battalion adjutant. 12 guns, manned by men who had come to the island to do something else. At 6:20 on the evening of the 20th, the 7th Marines completed the relief, and what was left of the 1st Marines came down out of the ridges and took over a quiet stretch of the eastern perimeter, where the line faced the mangroves, and very little happened. The 3rd Battalion stayed on for 2 more days under regimental control, pushing patrols north toward the coastal village of Garakoru. As an assault unit at the regimental level, the official history says, the regiment had temporarily ceased to exist. On the 21st, the Corps commander came up to see for himself. Major General Roy Geiger commanded the 3rd Amphibious Corps, the headquarters above the division, and he had run large ground operations on Bougainville and Guam, and knew what casualties of this order due to a unit's ability to do anything at all. He went first to the regiment's forward command post and spent time there with Colonel Puller and his men. Then he drove to the division command post. The order in which he made those 2 visits is most of what there is to know about the meeting that followed. What was said there survives in one letter, written afterward by an officer who was present. The Corps commander said he thought the 1st Marines should be relieved, and that he was considering moving an Army regimental combat team, a regiment with its own artillery and supporting units attached, over to Peleliu to replace them. At this, the division commander became greatly alarmed and asked that no such action be taken, saying he was sure he could secure the island in another day or 2. The outcome was that the Corps commander directed him to prepare plans for loading the 1st Marines for evacuation, and said he would take steps immediately to attach a regiment of the 81st Infantry Division. 4 days had been the estimate before the landing. This was the 6th. The figure reported for the regiment that day was 1,749, 56% of the regiment's strength, and 71% of the 1st Battalions. The regiment also reported what it had reduced getting there: 10 defended coral ridges, 3 blockhouses, 22 pillboxes, 144 defended caves. Those were reports, compiled in the field by men with other work to do, and no accurate count of any of it was ever made. The men coming out had stopped using the word regiment. What one of them called it instead was survivors. And yet Oliver Smith, writing about the same week, set down a different and equally true list. 7 days after the landing, the whole southern end of Peleliu was in American hands, along with the high ground that dominated the airfield. Every beach that would ever be used was in use. There was room to deploy all the artillery. Unloading went on unhampered except by weather. The historian who quoted him added a line of his own: that since all of Peleliu that possessed any strategic value had been secured, the early prediction of a quick conquest had not fallen so far short of literal realization. The order sending the regiment back to Pavuvu was written on the 28th of September. What made it possible to spare them was not the argument at the command post, but the airfield. With aircraft operating from the island itself, the danger of a Japanese landing on the northern coast had fallen away, and men could be released. Going at the high ground from the north had been one commander's opinion. Within 2 days, it would stop being an opinion. Colonel Harris ran the 5th Marines by a rule that fit in one sentence: every weapon that could be brought to bear would be fired before any infantry moved. Naval guns, artillery, tanks, aircraft, and only then men, in that order, however many hours it took to arrange them. It was not a new idea in the Pacific. What was unusual was how literally he meant it: the willingness to hold a whole attack standing where it was, with the daylight going, until the fire was ready, and to account for the delay afterward. On the night of the 22nd, the first steady rain of the operation came down. The division's report noted, with something like surprise, that it filled cans and canteens. It also covered the sea to the north, which was what the rain had been waited for. At 25 minutes to 6 the next morning, a destroyer off the northern tip picked up 7 barges 1,000 yards out. By 8:45 a cruiser reported all of them destroyed, and the following night there were more. There are as many versions of those 2 nights as there were units reporting them. The American accounts count barges sunk. The Japanese account counts barges that arrived. Both sides agree that some of the men got ashore, and that they did it by walking in the shallows. Intelligence afterward put the number who reached the island between 300 and 600. The head of an infantry battalion sent down from the big island to the north. They came ashore at the far end of Peleliu and stayed there. General Inoue said afterward that he had sent them for the sake of the garrison, and to steady the troops who were already on it. The road up into that country, the West Road, was the best road on the island and was not a good road. Shellfire broke it and traffic finished the job, and Army engineers widened it and packed it down with armored bulldozers on stretches still in plain view from the ridges above. Going north, the island changed. South of the village of Garakoru, the coral lay under heavy undergrowth, and north of it, the coral gave way to sand and the jungle to coconut palms, and the ground opened out until you could see where you were putting your feet. On the morning of the 25th, the division told the 5th Marines to pass through the Army positions at Garakoru and attack north. The regiment was scattered across the eastern half of the island, one battalion of it out on islets past the northeastern peninsula. The division's order went out at 10:30, the regiment's at 11, and at 1 o'clock the 1st Battalion was attacking. The battalion on the islets waded several hundred yards of reef and fell into line after dark. By late afternoon, the leading battalion had taken the Japanese radio station and gone past it. That night it was fired on from 3 sides and could see none of what was firing. The artillery answered blind and by method. A battery fired on points chosen off a map and an air photograph, and wherever the return fire slackened, that point was kept under slow, irregular fire until morning. Harris had gone so far forward that his junction with the Army existed mostly on paper, and he broke contact on purpose rather than give the ground back. On the 26th, the 3rd Battalion took the high ground on the east side and came out on the far shore, and the island was cut in two. That same afternoon, behind them, Army infantry and a small mixed column of tanks and amphibian tractors came down on the last hill at the northern end of the ridges. From a direction nobody was watching, what was left of the garrison in the center was now inside a line. And the war went past it on both sides and left it there. By noon on the 27th, the leading battalion had come up against the nose of the northern ridge and against the largest cave system on the island. It had 9 entrances, some of them opening toward the sea. At one point, the garrison inside it was reckoned at over 1,000 men. Where the ridge came down to the water, the road was pinched to the width of 1 tank, and above the pinch was a cave mouth looking straight down onto it. The first tank that tried to go through was knocked out. What the regiment did next is the whole method in one afternoon. Artillery laid a continuous barrage on the islet across the channel, and naval guns took the islet beyond it. Every 4th shell was smoke. Tanks on the shore fired smoke onto the beach opposite. Amphibian tanks ran out into the channel and stood on the reef 300 yards off, putting shell after shell directly into the cave mouth. Under all of it, at walking pace, the tanks and a rifle company went past the pinch in the road. The men in those northern ridges were not, for the most part, trained infantry. The caves had been dug by a naval construction battalion whose people had been miners and mining engineers in civilian life, and who stayed on to fight inside what they had built. With them were gunners, some infantry, and what was left of the battalion from the barges. How many were up there was never established. The last intelligence summary and one official account differ by a factor of 3. Nesebus lay across 500 yards of channel off the northern tip, and on the 28th a single battalion went over to it. The day was cool and cloudy with squalls of rain. The strafing was flown by Marine Corsairs that had landed on the Peleliu Strip 2 days before, their own aircraft, over their own landing, which had not happened before. And it went on until the leading wave was 30 yards from the water's edge. 13 tanks got over the reef, onto ground flat enough to use them properly. The whole thing was over in about 35 hours. The reports written further up the chain called the opposition on Nesebus light. The officers who had been on it did not. The battalion's own record put its losses for the 2 days at 48, and its regimental executive officer, writing later, put them lower and thought the operation had been called easy only because it had been done well. On the 27th, 84 Korean laborers and 7 Japanese came out of the ground and gave themselves up, against 12 prisoners taken in the whole operation up to that day. The next day, the regiment took 45 more. Men were coming out of the ground in the north in numbers the South had never produced, and the only thing that had changed was the order of the work. On the last day of September, organized resistance in the north was declared at an end, and the 5th Marines were pulled back to the radio station to be relieved. 2 days later, the Japanese opened entrances that had been sealed, and the army had to take ground it had already taken once. The regiment that took it again had come to Peleliu from the next island down the chain, where it had been doing this same work since the 17th. Angkor lies some 7 miles south of Peleliu, across open water. It is smaller and flatter, and there were phosphate workings on it, a little town, and narrow-gauge rail lines running out to the diggings. It was to be taken by the 81st Infantry Division, which had never been in action, and which had spent 2 years and 3 months getting ready to be. The division had maneuvered in Alabama and Tennessee and in the deserts of California and Arizona, then gone to amphibious school and rehearsed in Hawaii and off Guadalcanal, on 2 beaches chosen to imitate the ones on Angkor. On the evening of the 15th of September, still aboard ship, the men were given steak and chicken and frozen strawberries because the Navy fed troops well the night before a landing, and the Navy was certain the landing would be the 16th. The 16th came, and no order came with it. The reason was on Peleliu. That morning the Marines went across the airfield, and by midday, the division commander there had asked for no reinforcement of any kind. The conclusion drawn from that silence was that the big Army reserve would not be needed on Peleliu, and might as well be used on the island next door. At 2:30 that afternoon, the decision was made to release the division and land it the following morning. That left 18 hours. That was not the week's only decision. Earlier, the Navy had proposed taking Angkor first, and Major General Julian Smith had argued against it. Take Peleliu first and Angkor is cut off from reinforcement. Take Angkor first and the Japanese on the northern Palau's have time to strengthen Peleliu. That argument was accepted. He then argued that committing an element of the Corps Reserve before the situation on Peleliu was clear was premature. That one was not accepted, and the decision sat at the naval level, above the Corps. On the 16th, Admiral Halsey also ordered Ulithi taken, with resources on hand and as early as practicable. The 2 divisions that had been preparing for Yap and Ulithi were already gone to the landings in the Philippines. What was left was 1 unused regiment, the floating reserve of the Corps, the only ready troops available if anything went wrong on either island. Julian Smith recommended keeping it. That argument was not accepted either. By the morning of the 17th, neither the division nor the Corps had any reserve at all. The landing went in at 8:30 the next morning, 2 regiments on 2 beaches 2,000 yards apart, with a rocky shore in between. There was no reef worth the name. The landing ships ran in and let their ramps down dry, and there was no organized defense on either beach. From the water's edge, it was about 20 yards of sloping sand littered with debris, and then the rainforest began. There were no roads into it. The floor of it was packed with fallen trees and broken branches and knotted vine. And the men went in cutting and pushing in green half-light, feeling for the ground. The first 100 yards cost an hour. One account calls the forest a barrier more impassable than anything the Japanese could have built, and it was in there that the division took the first battle casualties of its existence. Where there were rail embankments, the troops advanced along them, because off the embankments, There was no advancing. 6 Army battalions had come ashore against about 1,400 defenders. The planners had expected at least 2,500, which is why 2 regiments were put in rather than 1. The rest of the garrison had been pulled back to the big northern island in July. What was there was a single infantry battalion with attached units under Major Ushio Goto, whose orders from General Inoue were not to spend his men on short attacks, but to hold on as long as he possibly could. On the 18th, 6 carrier fighters came in on a battalion of the 322nd Infantry and bombed and strafed it. 7 men were killed and 46 wounded. The investigation found the target had been marked wrongly, and the pilots were not at fault. The division commander asked that all airstrikes on Ongor stop, and they did. 2 days later, at 34 minutes past 10 on the morning of the 20th, he sent a message to the Corps. All organized resistance ceased on Ongor at 10:34. Island secure. That message is a statement, and there are 3 dates rather than 1. The island was called secure on the 20th of September. The Corps closed the assault and occupation phase on the 14th of October. The fighting on it ended on the 21st of October. The official Army history says plainly that no certain closing date can be assigned, and the reason is in the ground. After the 20th, what remained of the garrison went up into the northwestern hills. Those hills were the highest and most broken part of the island, and everything in them was underground and out of reach of ships' guns. One official account calls it a miniature version of the Umurbrogol. It was small enough that only 1 regiment could work in it at a time, and the 322nd Infantry worked in it for over a month. Goto was killed there on the night of the 19th of October, and the last organized positions were taken on the 21st. The people who came out of that pocket were islanders. On the 8th of October, 87 of them walked out to a company of Army engineers working nearby. The next day, 3 of those 87 went back in of their own accord and brought out 90 more. 183 came out of those hills altogether, every one of them having lived underground since the middle of September. The last free regiment, meanwhile, had sailed north. Ulithi is an atoll roughly halfway between the Palaus and Yap, and the operation to take it became notable for the absence of any enemy at all. Reconnaissance parties went ashore on one islet after another in rubber boats and found nothing. On one, a careful search turned up only a few Japanese graves. 2 islanders said the garrison had left months before, leaving 1 man who was an invalid, and when that island was occupied, he was not there either. Inside a week, the atoll was an anchorage for 300 ships. A month later, it held lighters, floating docks, barges, cranes for hoisting seaplanes, and the lagoon nobody had fought over became the fleet's forward base for everything that came after. 2 islands the same week, the same division, one of them taken without a shot fired, the other still being fought over 5 weeks later. As late as the middle of November, Colonel Nakagawa was still reporting that Ongor was holding out, and then admitted that this was his own guess. He had no way of knowing. The line between the 2 islands had been cut in September, and the Corps that might have sent someone to find out had nothing left to send anywhere. The ridges changed hands in the middle of October without changing shape. On the 15th and 16th, the Army took the Umurbrogol over from the 5th Marines, and at noon on the 16th, responsibility for everything inside the pocket passed to Colonel Robert Dark of the 321st Infantry. 9 days later, it passed again to Colonel Arthur Watson of the 323rd. The arithmetic of the rest of the campaign was settled then. 4 battalions, the 323rd Infantry, with a battalion of the 321st attached, working in relays. By late October, the pocket was an oval of ridges about 800 yards long and 400 to 500 across, with a road down either side. Somebody suggested, in the sour way men say such things, that it be fenced off with wire and declared a prisoner compound. It was a joke, and it was also an admission. Whatever was still inside those ridges no longer decided anything about the island. On the 20th of October, the southern Palaus passed to the Army Division. General Geiger and his staff flew out that morning. General Rupertus and the division staff that night. The same day, Major General Paul Miller announced that what he was undertaking was a siege operation, and undertook one. Reduction became a step-by-step business, methodical and slow, characterized more by hard work than by hard fighting. Not a life would be spent that could possibly be spared. 2 days before that, the last attack of the older kind had gone in. On the 18th, with permission to take the 5 brothers at whatever cost, the infantry had the first of them at 11 in the morning, the second at 11:45, the third by 1:15. By 5 in the afternoon, all 3 were gone again. On crests that narrow, there had been no time for the slow business of carrying sandbags up. On the 21st, the same men took the first brother back. This time the bags had been filled in advance at the bottom, and went up the slope hand to hand along a line of men while the work went on above. Over the next 2 days, the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th followed the same way, and this time nobody came off them. Between the 18th and the 21st, no new weapon reached the island. Only the order of the work had changed. The Marine Corps historian put it plainly. If any one implement could be said to have done more than any other to seal the outcome in the Umurbrogol, it would be the humble sandbag. A man could not make a hole to lie in, so he had to bring the hole with him. There was no loose soil up on the ridges, so it came from the beaches below, bag by bag. The division's own historian wrote the thing down as a procedure. Sandbag positions had to be built along the route of advance as fast as the advance was made. Because on the sides and tops of the ridges there was nothing between a man and accurate rifle fire, the bags were used instead of armor, in ground too rough and steep for tanks. Where a head could not be raised, the first layer was pushed forward with poles, and men crawled up behind it to finish the wall. A satisfactory day's advance, one account says, might measure 10 to 50 yards. In one battalion zone, the gain had to be measured in feet. The engineers rigged high lines up the slopes to lift sand, ammunition and rations to the crests, and the lines stayed up, and the loads kept going. Earlier that month, the Marines had taken a 75mm pack howitzer up onto a hill inside the pocket, carried up in pieces, assembled on top, banked around with sandbags, and fired it point blank into the mouth of a large cave. The Army noticed. Its officers went looking for other places where that could be done, and found them. The method was not invented in October. It had been argued for weeks by the commander of the 5th Marines. The Army took it up, wrote it down, and did it everywhere it could. Flame was part of the method, and the engineers went on improvising ways to deliver it. But most of the engineering was road work, grading, filling and widening a track, until something heavy could climb where nothing heavy had gone. There was one steady source of fresh water inside the pocket, a small pond in the valley on the eastern side. On the 23rd of October, a company took up positions around it. Engineers mounted a battery of searchlights and trained them on the water. Nothing was stormed. The water was put under observation, day and night, and after that it belonged to nobody. The nights had a shape of their own. There was firing all the time, and the area was kept under constant illumination. One officer counted as many as 3 60-millimeter illuminating shells hanging in the air at once. The action, the historian wrote afterward, was grinding and monotonous with few highlights. Nobody on the American side knew how many men were left in there. The estimates ran from about 500 to 1,200. The garrison commander's own messages, radioed out to Koror, came down from about 700 at the end of October to about 150 in the middle of November. All of these were reports. None of them was a count. Then the weather took over the schedule. From the 26th of October to the 1st of November it rained, with fog and poor visibility, and the operation stopped. It rained again from the 4th, and on the 6th, a typhoon came over the island and stayed until the morning of the 8th. Muller used the idle days to have pack howitzers hauled into place on the southern heights, ready for work that had not started yet. On the other side of that same weather, the garrison commander recorded that his units had been encouraged by the rain that fell all through the day of the 28th. Water was short in spite of it. Rations were cut, and ammunition was scarcer than rations. On the 3rd of November he halved the allowance for rifles, and noted it was uncertain whether even that would last until the 20th. Early in November he sent a longer report. 50 days had passed since the landing, he wrote, and parts of the force that had come into the high ground were observed strengthening their positions with sandbags and wire entanglements. His own unit attacked them every night, to no avail. 2 commands a few hundred yards apart, filing reports in 2 languages, had arrived at the same conclusion about what the decisive object on that island now was. The weather cleared and the work resumed. On the 13th, 2 battalions attacked at once into the valley on the east, and on the 17th tanks came into the southern end of it behind armored bulldozers. From the 14th to the 21st, the pocket contracted steadily and without event. Then, on the night of the 20th, the western slopes were given up. What was left of the garrison had gone into China Wall and was not coming out. On the 22nd, the last of the 5 brothers was occupied without resistance. What remained of the pocket now measured about 285 yards from north to south and 125 across. That same day, an engineer company began building a coral ramp up the eastern wall of the bowl below China Wall, so that vehicles could climb to the crest. They finished it on the afternoon of the 25th. By then the noise had already started to go out of the place. On the afternoon of the 24th, the assault companies noticed that resistance had almost entirely disappeared. Patrols went further than they expected to go, and found less than they expected to find. On the 26th, the tanks went up the new ramp and stood on top of China Wall, and there was very little left up there for them to do. The island had not been won that week. It had only become quieter. The decision that finally emptied the pocket was taken twice, and both times on Koror. Early in November, Major General Kenjiro Murai asked permission to make one general attack toward the airfield with what was left. Lieutenant General Sadai Inoue refused and put his reason in an order. "It is easy to die," he wrote, "but difficult to live on. We must select the difficult course and continue to fight." Because of the influence on the morale of the Japanese people, he named Saipan and what had happened there. On the 24th, the request went out again and was refused again, this time with a plainer argument. An attack of that kind would only spend the men to no purpose. Better to stay where they were, let the Americans come closer, and do whatever damage could still be done from ground they already held. At 5 that afternoon, the splitting of the remaining men into 17 teams was completed. At 6, the colors of the 2nd Infantry were destroyed and all documents burned. From that hour, the message said, the personnel left in the defense unit were Captain Namoto and 56 men. The burning of the colors was not a gesture that has to be guessed at. In Japanese military tradition, the Marine Corps historian wrote, the burning of any unit's colors signified that that unit had ceased to exist and should be stricken from the army lists. It was an administrative fact before it was anything else. The regiment ended in the paperwork first at 6 in the evening, and the men who had belonged to it were still standing there afterward. Then the set was used for the last time. Following the commander's wishes, we will attack the enemy everywhere. This will be the last message we will be able to send or receive. It went to Koror and was relayed on to Tokyo. That channel is most of what is known. The Americans found very few of the maps, orders, and working papers that intelligence officers with long experience had learned to take for granted, a scarcity remarked on at the time and never fully explained. Nearly everything we can say about the decisions inside those ridges comes from radio traffic to Koror and from a small number of interrogations afterward. A breakout was attempted in the night. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa and General Murai died in the command post, a 2-chamber cave 40 feet down a vertical shaft at the northern end of China Wall. What happened there is known from one prisoner, taken the next morning, and from records recovered after the war. Both men died there. No one witnessed it. Murai had been beside Nakagawa without being over him, and he had stayed so far in the background that many Japanese did not know he was on the island at all. That prisoner's statement on the 25th of November was the only intelligence in the entire operation that placed him on Peleliu. On the last day of December, both men were promoted, posthumously, to lieutenant general, an administrative act completed 5 weeks after the fact. On paper, somewhere else. On the morning of the 27th, the assault units went out in every zone at 7 o'clock. At 10:30, elements of one battalion moving north along the top of China Wall met another battalion coming south. A few yards away, across the gap, men of a 3rd battalion were visible on the rim of Death Valley. No fireworks, literal or metaphorical, marked the end of it. For long moments, the tired soldiers looked at one another in an uncanny silence, trying to take in that this was all there was. There wasn't any more. At 11, Colonel Watson reported to General Miller that the operation was completed. It was the 73rd day after the landing. The counts came together over the following months. Marine casualties on Peleliu, including Navy corpsmen and doctors, came to 6,526, of whom 1,252 were killed. The 81st Infantry Division lost 3,089, 404 of them killed, across Peleliu, Angkor, and Ngesabus together, 9,615 casualties, 1,656 dead. Those figures were revised more than once, as such figures are. Men carried as wounded in October were carried as dead by the following spring, and the totals that stood at the end are not the totals that stood at the time. Every official volume of this campaign gives a slightly different set, and every one of them is explaining the same men. No accurate count of the Japanese dead was ever made. The figure the history settled on, arrived at by subtraction, rather than by counting, is about 10,900. 202 prisoners were taken. One count puts it higher. And of those, 19 were Japanese servicemen. 7 from the Army, 12 from the Navy. The rest were laborers, most of them Korean. Many of them said afterward that although the American leaflets gave a time and a place for surrendering, they had not believed they could get there safely and had thought themselves better protected staying where they were. One number survives that puts a price on the method rather than on the men. The seizure of Peleliu consumed 1 American casualty and 1,589 rounds of ammunition for each Japanese defender, killed or driven from his prepared position. Whether the island had been worth taking was argued before it was taken, and never settled afterward. Admiral Oldendorf, who had commanded the guns off the beaches, wrote in a letter years later that if military leaders were gifted with the same accuracy of foresight that they are with hindsight, the assault and capture of the Palos would undoubtedly never have been attempted. The other side of the argument is equally documented and rather quieter. With the information available to them in the summer and early fall of 1944, Nimitz, MacArthur, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff all believed that only by securing the Palaus could the forces moving toward the Philippines be made safe. And because the conquest was an accomplished fact before the Philippines were invaded, no one can say with full certainty what would have happened had it not taken place. That is where the official histories leave it, and they leave it there deliberately. There is one sentence that comes closer than any of the arguments, and it was spoken afterward, quietly, by a man who had been there. Brigadier General Oliver Smith, the assistant commander of the 1st Marine Division, later phrased it this way: by the end of the first week, the division had control of everything on the island that it then needed, or later used. The Marine Corps historian, writing separately, made the same observation in different words, that because the fighting dragged on to such seemingly interminable length, it is easy to lose sight of the fact that the basic mission of the whole operation was accomplished within a week. The first week ended on the 22nd of September. The campaign ended on the 27th of November. Between those two dates lie 66 days. The airstrip was working within a week of the landing. Transport planes came in on the short strip while the ridges were still being fought over, and by the first week of October, the field could take almost anything that flew. The bombers that were supposed to fly from these islands to the Philippines began flying 2 months after that. By then, the landings they had been meant to cover were already ashore. The field was used, and it was useful. It staged aircraft and supplies through the long Philippine campaign, but the airfield was not needed in the way it had been meant to be needed. The Marines began leaving in the middle of October. They went in pieces as shipping came available. A battalion on one ship, a battalion on another. The last men of a motor transport company going out in November with the last of its vehicles. When the weather held up one loading, the men worked the winches and booms themselves rather than wait. The division went back to Pavuvu, to the same muddy roads and the same thin water supply it had left in August. Its next island was Okinawa. The Army stayed. In January, the general who had commanded the Wildcats handed the ground defense of Peleliu to the Island Command, and the Island Command settled into the long, unglamorous business of running a base. 5 days after that handover, Japanese landing craft came in on the eastern beaches in the dark to burn the aircraft and the ammunition and the headquarters. It did not work. It is the last time anything like an operation appears in the record. What is in the record after that is people in caves. In February, a prisoner was taken out of the big cave system in the northern ridge. He was not the only one living in it. 3 months after the fighting had stopped, in a hill that had been declared clear, with the base going about its work a mile away. The island command finished with that cave the same month. In the spring of 1947, a Japanese lieutenant and 26 men formally surrendered on Peleliu. It was one of the last surrender ceremonies of the Second World War, and it was thought at the time to be the end of it. It was not quite. 2 or 3 years later, men from Peleliu went up to a small island 3 miles north to shoot wild pigeons and chickens, the way people do on a quiet afternoon. The rifle fire went through the trees. It frightened a Japanese soldier who had been living in a cave there. And he came out onto the shore, where an old man from Peleliu, named Sisior, was fishing from his canoe. The soldier ran to him and asked to be saved from the enemy, who were shooting in the forest and in the mountains. His clothes had been sewn out of rice sacks. His beard had grown down to his hips. He was handed over to the district administration to be sent home to Japan. We know that story because a school teacher on Peleliu wrote it down in a letter 20 years afterward, when someone from the Marine Corps' historical office asked what people remembered. A few years later again, on Peleliu itself, food kept going missing from the gardens. The man taking it had been a civilian employee of the Japanese Navy, and he had been living in a cave since the war, and the gardens were how he was finally found. The islanders had been moved off before the battle. When they came back, no one wrote down. 20 years after the war ended, the debris of it still lay across the island. Vehicles and metal, and the shapes of positions, and the caves themselves, which do not fill in. Deep in the northern ridge, the largest of them is still there. And what was left in it is still lying where it was put down. The reef is still there too, of course. And at low tide it still shows, the way it showed on the morning the tractors crossed it. 600 yards of it, then 800. Depending where you stand, the water above it is very clear. From the air on a calm day, the whole island still looks simple. Sleep well.